Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. Welcoming you, my name is Kathryn Getek Soltis, and I welcome you on behalf of the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. We're really excited for today's webinar, which is on the basics of empathic listening for pastoral care ministry. And with me today is Dr. Theodore Smith. So I'd like to introduce you to him and to give you a few quick tips about how we'll proceed today, and then we'll begin. So it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Smith to us. He's worked in hospital ministry as a chaplain and pastoral educator for almost 40 years and is recently retired as a United Methodist minister. He's a published author and national speaker, and at present, Dr. Smith serves as the primary faculty person for the Pastoral Care Institute in the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston. It's a pastoral care ministry program for the laity. So we're really privileged to have his wisdom today as we learn more about empathic listening in the context of pastoral ministry, particularly as we think about how that translates to those affected by incarceration. And we'll have a presentation from Dr. Smith to begin, and then we'll open this up to some more conversation. So you're very welcome to the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button, and you can type questions in there, and we'll try to field as many as possible before the end of our time. We'll conclude at 2 o'clock Eastern time. And we just look forward to this time together. So let me just begin with a brief prayer, and we'll turn things over to Dr. Smith. Loving God, we ask for your blessing on our time together today. Open our hearts so that we can better respond to the needs of your people. Open our ears so we can recognize your wisdom wherever it may be found. Open our eyes to see our own brokenness and need for forgiveness. As we call to mind all those whose lives have been touched by the criminal justice system, we pray that you will draw close to those who feel abandoned or lost. We pray that you restore hope to those who have given up on themselves and to those who have given up on others. We pray that you give us the strength to confront the ways we fail one another and to confront the systems of injustice in which we participate. O God, may your good news enliven our ministries and give us a generous spirit to love as you love, to seek a peace that only you can give, and to work for a justice that we can know only through your mercy. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Kathryn, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here, a part of this webinar, and involved in this extremely important ministry. So thank you very much for this warm introduction and this invitation. And just for the record, I'm flattered, but I go by Ted, and I hope we'll be very collegial and informal during our time together. Before I actually begin with the content of my presentation, I'd like to share two presuppositions that I have about this topic of empathic listening. First of all, empathic listening is an art and not a science or a technique. It's my understanding that we have a wide group of people with a wide range of experiences and backgrounds. If this is new to you, if you've not had any kind of formal training in empathic listening, then I extend to you a very warm welcome, because you are in good company. We are all learners. There are no masters, in my judgment, in terms of empathic listening. It's an art. It's not a science or technique, and therefore it's always important to continue to learn and to go back to the basics. And for some of us today, this may be very, very basic, but it's my bias that it's good for all of us to review the very, very basics that we have. The second thing is that since empathic listening is an art and not a science, the categories of assessing one's effectiveness in empathic listening of right and wrong are not helpful. I find it far more helpful to use a category of effectiveness, and if you will, envision a continuum And on one end of the continuum would be a response that we might judge as less effective. And on the other end of the continuum, we would evaluate a response as being more effective. And of course, most of our responses are somewhere in the middle of this continuum of effectiveness. I think that's very, very important. And I think that frees us up in a lot of ways. So I want to begin by sharing a vignette. It was near the close of a long and illustrious and amazingly productive life. The 90-year-old John Adams, the second president of the United States, was not actively dying, but he was clearly declining. And a lot of people would come by his home, making calls to him, some coming out of curiosity, others coming out of genuine friendship and interest, but he received them all gladly. So writes David McCullough in this very massive biography, Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, by the way. But David McCullough goes on to talk a bit more about these visitors that came by to see the second president. He did say that only occasion would some people leave where John Adams was feeling low and more alone than before. Low and more alone than before. Of one particular couple, Adams himself wrote following their visit, quote, "They had eyes and ears to perceive the external person, but not feelings to sympathize with internal griefs, pains, anxieties, solitudes, and inquietudes within." But he complained only to himself and to a few other people. Now, this is 19th century language, to be sure, but Adams makes the point. This particular couple, this anonymous couple, by the way, we don't know who they are, had no feelings for the internal griefs, pains, and anxieties. Now, in fairness to this couple, they weren't the only ones that did not have an empathic connection with the second president. There were a few others, apparently, for whom he felt something like that. And though we don't know the details, it is interesting to conjecture about what happened during that visit. Why wasn't there a connection? Were they intimidated by visiting the second president? Maybe they came out of curiosity and froze and they were intimidated. Maybe their anxiety got to them and they simply talked and talked and talked and never began to listen, filling up the room with empty assurances, superficial chit-chat, and perhaps incessant questions. By the way, do you all know how many times pastoral care providers rely excessively on questions to make a connection with another person? I don't know what your experience is, but in my many years of working with colleagues in formation, so often we rely on questions, and suddenly the pastoral care setting turns into a courtroom, and the care receiver is on the witness stand because we, if you will, pepper that person with questions. But here we are, almost 200 years later, still discussing the negative impact of this particular couple's visit. In some cases, therefore, the lack of empathy is long-lasting. I think it's safe to say that these were regular folks, that they had no training in pastoral care ministry or pastoral care or caring ministries. They were simply Northeasterners living in the early 1800s. Some had relational skills and others didn't. But regardless of the capacity to make a connection with John Adams, we remember them for good or ill. And so it continues to this day. When we make an empathic connection with others, it's a true gift to them. And of course, the reverse is true also, that when others really connect with us, we feel gifted. So the importance of empathic connection is seen not only in terms of 200 years ago, but it would be absolutely truthful to say that it's essential to human experience as a whole. The renowned Austrian-American psychoanalyst Hans Kuholt put it this way: empathy is a psychological nutrient without which human life as we know it and cherish it could not be sustained. Would you agree with me that there are a lot of people who are psychologically malnourished? Another way of putting it in terms of our times today, we're called to feed our neighbors. Now, moving from empathy in terms of the broad human context, we turn our attention more toward our own discipline of pastoral care and draw upon the insights of pastoral theologians and pastoral care givers. We can have the first slide, second one. So, as I do so many times, I turn to a teacher of mine, though I never met the Father Henry Nouwen. I know this name is undoubtedly common to all of you, well known. But in Father Nouwen's writings, at one point he talked about what we do as healers in terms of the healing process and ourselves as healers. I'm sorry, I'm getting out of order. Just a second. Okay, I'm sorry. And so in one of his writings, Father Nouwen says this: providing healing means the creation of an empty but friendly space where those who suffer can tell their story to anyone who truly listens. And then he goes on to say this: the most important questions about healers, listeners, is not what to say or to do, but rather how to develop enough inner space where their story can be received. Now, I saw my internist last week, and I was told it was pretty humbling that I needed to lose some weight. So I intentionally drew our very effective caregiver here with a very slim physique. And I figured if I looked at this image enough, it might help me in terms of losing a bit more weight. But the point here is that this is to symbolize Father Nouwen's empty but friendly space that's interior to us as caregivers. Now, I would just say that whatever else I might share with you today, I hope that this image that you see there on your screen is one that you will continue to remember. Because if we don't get this, I'm not sure the rest of what we're going to talk about will make a lot of sense. If we don't have a place to receive that person's narrative, then we're not going to make any kind of meaningful empathic connection. The image looks deceptively simple, especially if we're with a talkative person. All we have to do, therefore, is just kind of sit back, relax, and let the narrative flow. We take it in. But too often, if our primary motive in terms of serving others is to help or to make a significant impact, then too often our interior space is filled with our well-intended, but sometimes poorly timed, brilliant insights, pearls of wisdom, life-saving answers. And obviously, when we're filled with that, there's no interior empty space with which to receive that person's narrative. There's no room in the end, if you will, in terms of a biblical image. I'd like to move on and make a couple more comments about empathy in general. If we can have the next slide, there we go, thank you. And then we'll go look at a definition. Another colleague of mine who I've learned an immense amount of material for is the Reverend Dr. Herbert Anderson, who currently is Professor Emeritus from Catholic Theological Union, where he taught pastoral care and pastoral theology for many, many years. So Herbert has some very, very important thoughts about empathy that I wanted to share with at least some of them. First of all, he would argue that empathy is feeling with a person and not for a person. Feeling for a person, one would say, is sympathy, but rather feeling with a person is empathy. But it's feeling with a person in a particular way, in a very, very important, nuanced way, and that is without equating their experience with mine. To realize that even though I may have a great deal of experience, every person is unique in the world, and I'm trying to understand that person, and I'm going to suspend my perspective and not move forward. Also, empathy is feeling with and then also responding. Empathy is a two-step process where I receive the person's narrative, but also respond in such a way to give assurance to that person that their story has been received by me. Otherwise put, that they have the assurance that their pain that they've experienced or shared with me is in my heart. Now, we live in a very, very diverse world, which is rich and celebrated and to be celebrated. But there are times that empathy is much more challenging because of a variety of sociological factors in terms of language, history, culture. That is another enormous topic in and of itself. But it should be noted at the outset that sometimes these factors are areas where we really do need to do some homework ourselves. Kathryn, I'm just aware of the time, and I'm not sure that I'm pacing myself well enough. So I'm going to continue, and then, but I'm just going to be conscious of the time. Okay.
Yeah, you're great. Keep going. Thank you.
I just want to make sure that we have time for Q&A is my only point. Okay. All right. This business about giving a response to a person and giving them the assurance that I've heard them accurately. This makes a very, very important point, and that is that the care receiver is always the judge of my capacity to make an empathic connection. Remember the couple with President Adams? Who made their assessment about their effectiveness? He did. And so part of the challenge is not only to listen carefully, but also to respond in a way using their language and words that are meaningful to them, which gives them the assurance that they have been heard. And unlike President Adams, not feeling low and alone. So why don't we, Matthew, take a look at the next slide, and we'll look at a definition to get. So this definition, one sentence definition, is very concise, but also nuanced. It comes from the Dictionary of Pastoral Care and Counseling by Dr. David Massey. And he says this, that empathy is the ability to identify with and experience another person's experience by, as much as possible, suspending one's own frame of reference to enter the perceptual and emotional world of the other. I think it's a very, very helpful definition, and I want to go into it in a bit more detail by looking at the next slide, please. So here we are back with our buddy, our caregiver, and what I've done is to include some of the basic concepts that Herbert Anderson talks about when he's describing empathy. And he says that the empathy process, as he calls it, begins with a pre-understanding or attitudes that we bring to the pastoral setting. And he has several attitudes that he wants us to keep in mind. And for him, the primary attitude is wonder. a sense of wonder. You know, when I first learned this from Herbert, I thought of wonder as something extremely rare and, if you will, a one-time experience. For me, one of those feelings of wonder was seeing a band of the Milky Way galaxy for the first time in Central America. I was just awestruck by the immense magnitude of these brilliant stars in the heavens. And I was truly taken with a sense of wonder. Some of us, the birth of a child is a very, very profound sense of wonder. But here, wonder in our context is much more concrete and specific. Is it possible for us even to go back to our places of ministry where we've served many, many years, or to return to a person that we've provided ministry for 20, 30 previous visits, to go back to that person with a sense of wonder? More specifically, to have to convey to that person that we are giving them that they feel rapt attention from us. When was the last time somebody related to you in a way where you felt like their full attention was focused on you? That of all of the 7+ billion people in the world, you were the most important person for them at that time, and that you had their complete and undivided attention. Or otherwise put, have we received the sense from the other person that they view us with amazed admiration? This language, these concepts are stretching to me, but I think they're very, very challenging and helpful. And that is, it gives a sense of freshness and energy to pastoral conversations that sometimes we might otherwise not have. Another important element in terms of empathy is a willingness to be surprised. Even though we think that our perspective is extremely important and valuable, and it is, people have a variety of experiences and worldviews that we don't have at all. And so it's important for us to be willing to be stretched when we encounter somebody else as we try to enter into their world. Obviously, another part of that is to be open, if you will, to the pastoral conversation in the sense of a journey. You know, to go back to the sense of wonder for just a second, another author talks about wonder this way. It is a searching attitude of simultaneously knowing and not knowing. A searching attitude of simultaneously knowing and not knowing. And this goes back to, in some ways, captures Massey's definition about empathy, where we suspend our judgment, but then we try to enter into the world of the other person. So if I'm listening to a person and they're sharing an experience that I've had something very, very similar to it, that has we listen in a very, very important way where I don't ignore my experience with something that's similar to theirs, but I hold it in abeyance, if you will, and give my full attention to the nuances and the subtleties of their experience without directly appealing to mine. So this raises a larger question about what place does sharing personal history have in listening empathically. And quite frankly, there are different views among professionals in this area, at least in terms of colleagues that I've talked with. I'll simply give you one view, and that's mine. And that is that in this case, less is more. For me, I want to keep my attention as much on that person as I possibly can. And my use of personal history is going to be extremely limited. And it's only going to be shared in the service of trying to help facilitate and promote another person's disclosure of their story. Kathryn, where are we? You want to want me to pause and then let's kind of open things up?
Sure, we can do that. I just want to take a moment. I see some questions coming in just about logistics here in terms of the webinar and getting access to PowerPoint slides. So this webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent out to all of you, all the participants who registered within the week. So you'll be able to access this entire recording. And Ted, I don't know if you'd be willing to have your PowerPoint slides attached to that email,
Sure,
but we could do that as well. So. Yeah. So rest assured for those who are trying to take quick notes that this will be accessible, and you'll all receive that by email within the week. Yeah. So we can, I can make a couple of comments in terms of highlighting some ways I think there are some particularly challenging pieces, right, within the context of prison ministry. And I encourage you, we've had maybe just a couple of questions come in, but others who want to submit questions, again, there's a Q&A little icon at the bottom. You're welcome to click on that and type something in, and we'll try to field those. So I'll just make just a couple quick points. I mean, I think, Ted, you mentioned really helpfully about the sociological factors, right? That can be a challenge in terms of making connections. And I think that that's a really relevant issue, right? Sort of the limits and a consciousness of intercultural relationships that are going on within prison ministry. And that's, it's both in terms of logistics, in terms of understanding, how one's communication is even being received. So while you may think that you are communicating a desire to listen and get to know someone, it can be taken as intrusive or manipulative. So there's lots of ways that I think one has to have your radar up in particular, because just going in with the assumption that you really can't understand the experience and the assumptions that the other person is making. And so there's a deep humility that I think is required in our work. But I think it's also, there's no way for us, none of us come in as neutral bodies, right? And so, it's really important for me when I'm doing my ministry, that I'm very aware and sometimes claim explicitly, right? I'm a white woman, heterosexual, highly educated, I have certain experiences that frame my perspectives and that limit my ability to really enter into others' experiences. And so the more I can be honest about the limitedness of my experience, I think the more I can create that empty space that you talked about, right? Because if I don't name the ways in which I've already filled it up with my own presuppositions and my own experiences, then one might think one's more open than one is. So I think we have to be really careful about that intercultural awareness when we're trying to make these connections, and be at peace with the fact of the narrowness of where we come from, with a desire to welcome the narrative, but also a humility to know that there may be really huge challenges in making some of those connections.
That's a very good point. If I could just jump in real quickly to say thank you. I think humility is on one of those slides, and one of the basic things that probably could have been said at the outset is that empathy is always momentary, partial, limited. It's never complete, even when there is a great commonality between the two people involved, because there's mystery about that other person that one can never fully capture. So a sense of humility, and without trying to be apologetic about it all, is very, very important. And then when you factor in cultural differences, then it makes it even to make that bridge is even more challenging and difficult, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other thing you just mentioned too about the commonality, I mean, that which is the basis, right? I mean, in terms of, it's our faith that we are brothers and sisters, right? That there is a fundamental connection that we have just as children of God, right? That makes this possible. But at the same time, and I think in a heightened sense, in prison ministry, while there's a commonness, there's also a power differential that exists, in terms of I choose when I come in and when I leave. There's no way for the men and women that I work with to compel me or to make sure that I follow up on anything I do, right, or say. And so that power differential, but then even more so the fact that the women and men who are incarcerated or who've had that experience are, and even those who are visiting, right, are, existing within a system of complete power of others. There's a context of power over in which they're living in all the time. And so, I think that's really important for us to have in the back of our mind when we're making these connections, because we're not just listening, in a vacuum. We're listening and connecting to someone, and in a space that has real power and potential for abuse and oppression, right? So that's, and so one thing that I often think about is how, in a way, I can choose to connect and be open to this person's narrative within that power system, or I can also try to carve out that listening space, that narrative space, as a way of actually sort of resisting that overarching power narrative and say that actually the real power here is the power that lies in God, right? And so to try to transcend the overarching power structure of a system that might be experienced as oppressive or abusive by the way that we connect. So I could say more about that later if folks have some thoughts, but maybe it would be a good moment to get some questions in, or Ted, if you had some more comments that you wanted to make.
Let's look at the questions.
Okay, great. So one question that's come in is about trying to get an individual to share. So if an encounter with a patient or an individual in any sort of chaplaincy situation, if that encounter is not question driven, then how would you propose to move that person enough to share their narrative is the question. So
I was hoping we'd get through the seminar before that particular question, because that's a perennial question. So let me make a couple comments. Number one, just so I'm clear, I am not saying that questions in and of themselves don't have an important and valid place within pastoral conversations and the effort to listen empathically. So I'm not putting this kind of absolute prohibition on questions. My point was that, and I understand it, sometimes we rely excessively on questions. I don't have a magic formula. One thing to keep in mind is to try, if we're going to ask questions, to ask open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions, in terms of questions that can be responded to in terms of yes or no. It may sound somewhat trite, but expressions like, help me understand more about what you said just a moment ago, is a very, very important question, but it goes back into trying to elicit a more response from that other person. It's hard to make generalizations because each setting and each conversation is unique in and of itself. To the extent that we're willing to be candid with that other person, if we feel like that their resonance in terms of sharing with us, that you're speculating it's based on something that might be going on, simply to name it is also, I think, a very, very important thing to do. So I wish we had a person who asked the question to comment on these comments. Kathryn, you want to talk yourself about the...
Sure. Well, that's great. I mean, I think we actually got quite a number of questions come in, and so maybe if someone wants to follow up, we can do that. And then, but I'll maybe put the next question out, which is
Sure.
also a challenging one. How do you connect with the person who has given up all remnants of hope?
Excellent question. A couple of quick thoughts that come to my mind. One is the concept of accompaniment that we can talk about. We can characterize a pastoral ministry as that we will accompany a person through whatever valley they're going through. First of all, to hear them clearly, and to when we talk about empathic listening, it's important that it be sustained empathic listening more than 15 seconds. That it really has to be something that we continue to try to elicit their story and their comments. I think if we convey to them that they are of immense importance to us, that in spite of the darkness of their life at that time, that they are not alone, and that those words are not mere rhetoric, but is something that they feel in their soul that we're communicating to them. I'm not trying to suggest that provides a quick and easy answer, but that is using us, if you will, incarnational theology, to say to that person, I hear that you're in a sense of despair. You might want to refer to, if they can tolerate it, Psalm 88, which is one of those psalms that got into the Psalter, where it's unrelieved despair and does not end on an affirming note like so many of the laments in the Psalter. So there is a place in the biblical witness for total darkness or blackness. But what we're trying to give them a human experience which says that there is hope because of the connection that we're providing. And I think that's done probably more effectively non-verbally, because I don't know that words in and of themselves only would do the trick.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's where I think the notion of a ministry of presence, right, is really key. That it's by us, our embodied choice to be with this person.
Right.
This is another limit. Like there's nothing we can do that can formulaically give someone hope, right? But we can hold that space open to say, you may not feel it or see it, but I experience hope for you and that's why I'm here. One is not even be explicit about it. So
I just make that's very helpful. And a quick comment on that is the ability to sit with a person in silence is also a very, very key and important quality about being fully present and making this kind of empathic connection. So again, I use the analogy of filling the room up with empty assurances is the opposite of what empathy is in terms of that context.
Yeah. So related to this, there are a couple questions that have come in about body language and how to sort of connect, what techniques are recommended to connect with someone who might not be able to verbalize very well. So I don't know if Ted, if you had other thoughts about nonverbal communication that's helpful to facilitate that empathic connection.
Well, it is, and I think one basic guideline is to be extremely sensitive to culture, to customs, to be as informed as we possibly can in terms of what is okay and what might be considered intrusive to the other person. So there's a balance between not invading their space, but also not being distant, so that there is, at least in terms of the position of the two people, a sense of intimacy, emotional, sacred intimacy. I would like to think that all of us, or else we wouldn't be on this webinar, have a heartfelt commitment to show compassion to another person, and that deep internal value is expressed in different ways, including non-verbally. And so one of the things that Anderson talks about in terms of walking into a room is before we walk in, is to clear the clutter. And part of that is whatever we think would contaminate our ability to connect with that other person. And to have this, again, I think the word wonder is a very suggestive word, and where there is energy and a lightness to us in terms of our persona that could be picked up by the other person.
Okay. Let me get some other questions in here. One person's asked about distinguishing among empathy, compassion, and sympathy, and when one might be more appropriate than another. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah. The expression, "I'm so sorry," I've heard scholars say that that is an expression of what we feel for the other person, as opposed to feeling with the other person, and therefore the distinction is made between empathy and sympathy. I continue to use the expression, "I am so sorry," when I've learned that a person is going through a crisis or has had some extremely difficult circumstance that has come invading into their life. This is where nonverbal stuff is very, very important, because I think that can be said in a very, very compassionate way, where they have a genuine sense that I'm feeling with them, even though I'm referencing myself in terms of that expression, "I am so sorry for you." I thought of trying to think of other, "I grieve for you." Well, that's still, I is the subject of that sentence, though the verbs are a little different. Is this speaking, do you think, to the question? I'm not sure that I'm.
Yeah, I don't know if are there definitions that you use in terms of compassion, empathy, or maybe those distinctions aren't as clear.
Well, compassion is something that I think, if you will, goes down to the very marrow of our bone, or in terms of the bowels of our soul, if you will. That if it's going to be genuine and convey something that would be meaningful to the other person, then it has to be felt very, very deeply, and has to be genuine from our part. So, I think compassion is an essential ingredient in terms of really making an empathic connection to another person. We can have pity for another person, and we can listen to their story, but I don't think that pity is something, in my mind, quite different, and doesn't provide the kind of empathic connection that we all want to achieve.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. I mean, I think what I'm hearing too is the idea that there's a difference between emotions that can, be applied to a situation versus opening the kind of experience where you yourself might be transformed, right? You talked earlier about, the reciprocity, which I think is really important, right? That if it's, I think, truly empathic listening, then, and you're really feeling with, then that may change you, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And whereas some other emotions may just be how you're a response, but it's not necessarily opening yourself up to actually being changed by it.
Exactly.
So I think that's what we're talking about here, which is.
And thank you for going back to that. And that's an extremely important point in terms of not only a change in the sense of my worldview might be, not might be, should be, will be, if I'm really making an empathic connection, my worldview will be expanded a little bit, but I will experience life at some measure from that other person, and their experience of living and life is going to be different from mine. Not qualitatively different necessarily, but enough different that I need to be open to that and be willing to be affected by it. I might just say in my own tradition, the United Methodist Church, I don't know if folks that are joining us, but we had a major worldwide conference last week in St. Louis, a very contentious time. And so one of the respected leaders of the church said there was precious little listening done of this gathering of about 800 delegates. And so that's where I just cite that as an example where empathic listening didn't take place as a rule. And so we can always strive for it, but sometimes it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
In meaningful ways.
And going to the idea of being changed by empathy, the timing of this webinar is fortuitous because today is actually a National Day of Empathy for those who've been impacted by the criminal justice system, and their efforts nationwide here where I'm at in Philadelphia, but around the country, folks who've been touched by the criminal justice system are meeting with lawmakers. But I think it's really, it's significant that it's called the Day of Empathy because it suggests that, when we can really enter into these experiences and be shaped by the narratives of others, it may actually lead to us making different decisions, taking different social action, right? So, the second, you talked about it being two steps, right? That there's a response, feeling with and response. And so that response can be really significant because of the changes that are happening. So, great. Let's see, another, maybe connecting to this point about the way that, it really can be transformative of the person experiencing it. There's also a negative side to that. And someone was asking about, when listening to a person's story, when that triggers the minister's own pain and brings forth personal trauma that surfaces, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to be aware of it is the first essential step. And awareness is just a basic building block toward ministry, but also certainly the kind of relation building that we're trying to do about. To acknowledge it to ourselves, take it seriously, and if we need consultation from colleagues or in a more professional way, then it's our responsibility to move out and take the initiative and do that. I don't think it's wise to, and I'm not saying it was implied in the question, for us to reference it to that other person at the time, but again, to be aware of that. And you were just a minute ago talking about presence. And so one author talks about presence in terms of 3 levels of awareness, aware that we represent something beyond ourselves and are comfortable with that, and that will evoke something, a response from other people. An awareness of what that other person is going through to the extent that we can, but also self-awareness in terms of what's going on with us internally. And that's an example where that kind of internal awareness is extremely important.
Yeah. Another question that's come in is about avoiding condescension. How can one be empathically listening but avoid condescension? I think, and which really I think speaks also to the inevitability of recognizing the power differential that often exists, but in a particular way in prison ministry.
Yeah, that's another excellent question. To be aware of language and our best attempts to use language in a way that is well received and understood. not perfectly, but that's certainly one of the important awarenesses. One of the slides that I didn't get to is suggestion is that respect is the first posture, if you will, that we have with another person that we're ministering to. For the last few years in my ministry, I worked for a Catholic-based hospital, CHI, and their values, they intentionally did not use the word respect, but use the word reverence, which I think is a part of the culture of Catholic health. And to continue to remind ourselves that this person is a person of infinite sacred worth that is before us is a perspective that's very, very important.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Well, and sometimes, sometimes that even is communicated in some silence, right? I think, when you mentioned earlier in your presentation about sort of having lots of things at the ready, some ideas and pearls of wisdom, right, that would crowd out that empty space. And so I think when we walk in feeling like we have answers and we know what to say, and we're, it is problematic and shows that we're really not there. We're really not welcoming in. And so, that accompaniment, that ministry of presence, is the fact that we don't have the answers necessarily, but we're there. And sometimes even in moments of silence, showing how we ourselves are perplexed and speechless at some of the gravity of the situation, can communicate that instead of always being the one to fix. I think, we want people to be helped, but we're not always the one who have the tools for that. And so it's
right.
Finding ways to communicate that. Yeah.
Well, and we all want to make a difference to the better, to the positive in a person's life. And we all want to help, quote unquote. A lot of pastoral care is based on what does it mean to help in that kind of situation. And for a lot of us, especially in terms of formation process, it's redefining helping in a way that might seem insignificant or minimize our full potential, but it is profoundly important, and I would suggest very, very distinct in terms of human interaction. I think an empathic connection is uncommon in our world.
Nice. When we're nearing the end of our time, but I think we might be able to get in at least one more question here before we close. And at the end, I want to tell you about some things going forward. But a question that's come in was about whether empathy creates an expectation of a type of response from the person. Should empathy create an expectation of a certain type of response?
Well, I've said more than once, I don't say this to let's just say a hospital patient, but I go in and I'm saying, look, if you get to know me, you'll like me. I'm a good guy, so just work with me a little bit, and you'll enjoy this visit, and it'll be a positive part of your day. So it's no fun to be rejected. I'm not saying thrown out of the room, but in terms of a sense of humility and also honesty, there'll be people with whom I don't connect, and who, in spite of all of my charm and wit and all that good stuff, they're not going to be that moved or impressed. So I'd like to think that I can have the capacity to connect with a wide range of people, but the reality is that range may be a bit more narrow than I want to admit to myself or to other people.
And I think I would
relate to me better to that other person, then a referral would be helpful.
Yeah. No, I would just add to that. that I think that there's the empathic relationship is really something that we're called to by our faith. And so, I don't know, I think it has the potential for eliciting a response, but it's not, its value is not contingent upon that. So, I would say that, it's a value to offer that space and that invitation and that recognition of that person and their own experiences. If it's not, returned in the same way, then, that's, then one moves on and respects that boundary. But it doesn't eliminate the value of making that offer. It says, I see you and you're worth this invitation, and I respect you to move away if it's not accepted.
Yeah.
So.
And just like, there have been occasions where in a hospital and praying with a person, their tradition is different enough from mine that in spite of my best efforts, leading intercessory prayer with them had built-in limits. And that's just part of what it means to work in a very, very diverse setting.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I think we may want to turn now to just letting you all know about the next opportunities being offered. Matthew, do you want to help us with that final slide? I really appreciate everyone's attention, and I'm sorry that there were some other questions that came in that we didn't have time to get to. But this is a really rich conversation. I'm really grateful to you, Ted, for all of the wisdom that you've shared with us today. The Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition is continuing to host webinars, and so our next one will be on Wednesday, April 3rd. And as you can see, it's going to be on the topic of recruiting volunteers to ministry. And the featured speakers for that webinar are Sister Rita Mary Hayward and Harry Dudley, who will be talking about the really important work of bringing other workers into the vineyard, supporting volunteers in ministry to the incarcerated and their loved ones. So again, that's Wednesday, April 3rd. The time of that webinar is 3 o'clock Eastern time. And you see there's a link, a site for registering. But also know that, this webinar, as I mentioned before, is being recorded. It's going to be posted within the week. You'll receive an email with that link. And when you'll also get, since you've registered for this, you will get an email inviting you to register for the next one. So you don't have to write that long website down. You will get an email with a link so that we hopefully will see you again on April 3rd. I'm grateful for everyone's time today and for the seriousness with which folks engage in this, which just speaks of the kind of really important ministry that's going on around the country, around the world. So many thanks to you, Ted. And I don't know if you have any closing comments you want to offer.
Well, I'm simply grateful for the invitation, and I found it very stimulating. And thank you, Kathryn, very much for your collaboration here, and for those who sent in questions.
All right, wonderful. Well, everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you once again. You'll be receiving an email, and hope we see you on Wednesday, April 3rd for the next webinar from Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye. Peace.